Hello everybody! In this video, I would like to explain what modern monetary theory is, which I will call MMT for short. My portrayal of MMT will be largely based on Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. Due to the limitations of the format, I'm going to be admittedly giving a greatly simplified portrayal of MMT. My goal is to convey the essential insights and intuitions of modern monetary theory in an easy to understand way, and point you to further resources if you want to learn more. So what is modern monetary theory? Modern monetary theory is a non-traditional theory of economics that seeks to better explain how fiat currencies work. It builds off of insights from other economic theories and ideas, including Keynesian economics, chartalism, Abba Lerner's functional finance, and Wynne Godley's sectoral balances. Wall Street investor Warren Mosler is considered the godfather of MMT, and MMT is advocated for by a cohort of economists, including our very own certified gigachad, Stephanie Kelton. Modern monetary theory is favored by some on the political left because it provides a framework for arguing on behalf of progressive economic reform. Modern monetary theory is not Marxist, nor does it entail advocacy for socialism. Its core insights are, however, compatible with Marxism, so whether you are a socialist or a progressive liberal, this video is worth watching. Or if you're a centrist, conservative, or don't really care about politics, this video is also worth watching. Just anybody, really, anybody watch the video, please. Even dogs. Dogs can watch the video. Modern monetary theory can be said to have these three key principles. Let's take a look at the first one. The value of a fiat currency ultimately comes from the state's ability to levy taxes. The US and many other developed nations have fiat money as opposed to representative or commodity money, the latter of which get their value because they represent or are made of some intrinsically valuable commodity like gold. According to MMT, money arises and gets value from the levying of taxes. This may not seem intuitively obvious, and it's different from the traditional story about how money emerges. The story you may be familiar with is that people used to trade by exchanging goods directly in a barter economy, and agreed upon money as a convention in order to grease the wheels. The problem with this is that there is very little historical evidence for it. Anthropologist David Graeber, in his book, Debt: The First 5,000 Years, explains how this story is wrong. In reality, debt existed as a means of trade before barter. So, modern monetary theorists argue that money comes from the state and that fiat currency gets its value from the state's ability to levy taxes. So how on earth does that work? Warren Mosler explains it with the household chores example. So, imagine a dad with some lazy kids who just won't do any chores. One day, he gets a bright idea and says, "Hey kids, how about I give you some of my very own business cards in exchange for doing chores?" But he was met with silence. "Kids? Nah, I'm good." "Why not?" "Nobody wants your damn business cards. They're frickin' useless, old man." Taken aback by his impudent son, he rethinks his proposal. The kids were right. His business cards were frickin' useless. So he came up with a much better idea. "How about this? If you don't give me 30 of these cards every month, I'll smash your Xbox and I'll rip your heart out and fuck." Before you know it, the kids are, happily motivated to do their chores, and a whole economy develops around it, with the kids trading the business cards to each other in exchange for favors, because now the business cards are worth something. It's the same thing with the government. If you don't pay taxes, the state will do much worse than smash your Xbox. It reclaims your land, and you're done for. You need fresh, crisp, green American dollars so you can pay taxes. And now they have value, so it's worth trading stuff for them. Presto, an economy. This idea about how money gets its value is known as chartalism. Just as the dad doesn't need his own business cards, the government doesn't need the money. We do. Quite simply, the taxpayers don't fund the government. The government funds the taxpayers. The only financial limitations of the government, like those of the Social Security Trust Fund or the pay-go rule, are entirely artificial and self-imposed. The government, like the dad, needs people to do stuff like build bridges, be doctors, and perform drone strikes on innocent children in the Middle East. The second core principle is that what really matters are real economic outcomes, not budgetary ones. A strong economy is one where we have capital, infrastructure, and and resources and are able to efficiently allocate them. Whether the numbers are red or black in some balance book somewhere, we don't care. Famous economist John Maynard Keynes captured the sentiment succinctly with a witty quote. He was being criticized for his grandiose plans to rebuild London after World War II and was asked where the money would come from. Keynes replied, "We build houses with bricks and mortar, not with money." The idea makes sense when you think about it. Ultimately, it's not the money itself that matters, but it's the stuff and labor that matters. And so it follows that the limits on our economy are not set by our budget, but instead by our real resources. This brings us to principle 3. Economic freedom for a state requires monetary sovereignty. Monetary sovereignty could be defined as the monopoly of a state over its currency. MMT economists speak of monetary sovereignty as a broad gradient, with some countries falling on either end of the spectrum and some in the middle. More monetary sovereignty effectively means that a governing body has more control over the value of its currency. This principle explains why countries like the United States and Japan can get away with deficit spending and debts upwards of 240% of GDP without any serious economic side effects, while on the other hand, countries like Greece and Venezuela collapse under the weight of their debt. Monetary sovereignty is increased by having a fiat currency with a floating exchange rate, as opposed to having a fixed exchange rate like with a gold standard. Monetary sovereignty is decreased by having debts in a foreign currency, like with the Weimar Republic, or by being dependent on foreign capital or imports, which is the case with many third world countries. When a country has a high degree of monetary sovereignty, it is more free to engage in things such as deficit spending without running the risk of other economic side effects. In order to get a fuller understanding of modern monetary theory, we need to see how these principles apply to concrete economic issues. Many of MMT's prescriptions contradict mainstream economic ideas. In general, it's not so much a function of mainstream economics being wrong so much as being misapplied. Traditional views of economics may accurately describe fixed exchange rate currencies, but since they fail to grasp MMT's insights into how fiat currencies work, they result in bad judgments. We can apply what we've learned so far to these issues right here. Let's begin with the issue of borrowing and paying back the debt. Fear of the growing debt is so commonplace, it is easy to assume that it actually even is a problem. Mainstream economists and politicians, liberal and conservative alike, have all bemoaned the mounting debt and have only squabbled about how best to reduce it. Republicans want to rein in expenditures and Democrats want higher taxes. The only way to reduce the debt they seem to agree on is to increase military spending. Weird. At some point, they say the taxpayers are going to have to foot the bill. If we don't do it sometime soon, we might even run out of money. Luckily, none of this is true, and we can use what we've learned about MMT already to see why. Recall Principle 1 and how the government funds the taxpayers. Imagine being concerned about being able to pay a debt to somebody when the debt is in your own IOUs. It's like watching a game of basketball and asking, wait, where does the scorekeeper get all the points from? As long as the government has debts in its own currency, it can simply just print more. This may not always be a wise move for reasons that we'll get to in a minute, but it's a point of fact that it just can't run out of money. The federal government, unlike households, businesses, or state and local governments, is a currency issuer and not a currency user, so it doesn't have to worry about balancing the books like they do. For this reason, we don't have to worry about borrowing and interest rates going out of control either. Interest rates go up when an investment becomes risky, because a larger payoff is required to offset the risk that you might lose your investment. But when a government with a high level of monetary sovereignty is borrowing its own currency, there's no risk that it can't pay the money back, so interest rates don't climb up. This is why the interest rates of currencies with floating exchange rates trend towards 0%. Furthermore, the rules of the primary market in which government bonds are sold today give the government substantial control over the price of bonds. And if we really wanted to, we could have it so that the Federal Reserve sets the price of bonds directly like it did in World War II, and like Japan's central bank does today. This is to be contrasted, however, with countries that have a low level of monetary sovereignty. A real-world example of this is Greece, who incurred debts in euros, which Greece itself did not produce. So investors demanded higher rates of return because there was a real concern that Greece might actually run out of euros. But wait, you object, if we just print out money, won't that have dire economic consequences like inflation? Look at Venezuela. And the answer is, well, yeah, possibly. That's a great segue to issue number 2. In a gross sense, too much spending leads to inflation, and too little spending will lead to unemployment and stagnation. Modern monetary theory does not claim that we can just print out as much money as we want without any consequences. That is a straw man. MMT helps us responsibly manage the economy and avoid real economic maladies such as hyperinflation, out of control interest rates, and unemployment by focusing on our real economic resources. To better understand MMT's take on inflation, let's contrast it with a competing view of inflation, the quantity theory of money. Supporters of the theory are called monetarists, and they argue that inflation is a function of how much money is in the economy. They ground this in assumptions about what is known as the equation of exchange. The equation says simply that the quantity of money times the velocity of money, that is how frequently each unit of money changes hands, is equal to the amount of inflation, relative to some arbitrary standard, times the total economic output, like GDP. The equation is an identity and is therefore always true, but economists disagree about how a change in one variable affects the others. Monetarists argue that economic output and the velocity of money remain more or less constant under an increase of the money supply, meaning that an increase in the money supply must always increase the price level, or in other words, cause inflation. The intuition behind this is compelling. As something becomes more plentiful, it probably becomes less valuable, since it's less rare and easier to get. But there's a problem with this view. After the 2008 crisis, Congress passed a $787 billion fiscal stimulus, and the Federal Reserve injected trillions of dollars into the economy with quantitative easing. And, well, basically nothing happened. And nothing happened during the quantitative easing at the start of the coronavirus pandemic either. Modern monetary theory, on the other hand, argues that spending is not inherently inflationary. Government spending is inflationary only when it bids away resources from the private sector. Imagine there's a company that sells plumbuses, and its machines are working at full capacity, making 100 plumbuses a month, and that its customers hungrily buy them all up as soon as they hit the shelves so that they can squargle. If Uncle Sam steps into the picture and wants to place an order for 50 plumbuses, the plumbus company is in a situation where it literally cannot produce enough plumbuses for everyone at the current price. The plumbus company responds to the scarcity by increasing the price. In this microcosm, the value of money with respect to plumbuses has fallen, and this is therefore per se inflation. Economists call this kind of inflation demand pull inflation, and MMT economists argue that it is this kind of inflation that could arise from too much government spending. The important thing to notice here is how the price increase occurred in response to a lack of resources. If the plumbus company had had more plumbus machines, it could have made more money by just making and selling more plumbuses at the old market price. In line with our second principle of MMT, the real limit on plumbus production is the productive capacity of the plumbus maker. And when watching for inflation, the thing to look out for is whether the price paid by the government is above the market price. If this seems confusing, pause the video and walk through the toy example I've provided here. Now, it's not just government spending that can cause inflation. Demand pull inflation could come from a private entity too. So in order to control for inflation, governments need to tax money away from the right places, like, for example, the other plumbus customers, or to spend in areas where the real resources aren't saturated. Once we understand this story, we see that it doesn't matter whether the spending is occurring during a budget surplus or a budget deficit. You could have a budget deficit but cause no inflation, and you could also have a budget surplus but still have inflationary spending. At the end of the day, the real limit on our economy has to do with our real resources and productive capacity. MMT actually encourages us to be more responsible by watching out for inflation directly rather than being focused on the budget. Okay, can we get a segue? Oh yeah, but won't all of this deficit spending have adverse effects on the health of the economy? Thanks for asking. What a great segue to our next point. Deficit spending and the health of the economy. Some people argue that deficit spending is bad for the economy. They contend that government borrowing that pays for the deficit spending can crowd out private investment. When the government borrows, it borrows from people and businesses whose savings would otherwise finance private investment in productive capital. To grapple with this contention, we need to understand better how borrowing and the money supply works, and we'll begin with the bucket analogy. Economist Wynne Godley relates the supply of money to a couple of buckets full of money. All of the money we have initially comes from the government. The only way we can get money into the private sector bucket is by taking it out of the government bucket first. When we collect money in the form of taxes, we are doing the reverse, sucking money out of the private sector bucket and dumping it into the government's bucket. Thinking about it this way, we see that government deficits equal private sector surpluses, and government surpluses equal private sector deficits. Quite simply, the government's red ink is our black ink. When Godley calls this the one equation model of the world. It's not a theory, but a simple accounting identity. Whether you disagree with MMT or not, it's just a logically necessary fact. This helps us to explain government borrowing too. Borrowing is really a misnomer, because the government is borrowing something that it produces itself. What really happens is that entities in the private sector accumulate more actual crisp, Merc and green dollars than they need, and they want to invest it into a better asset. So they go to the government and exchange it for T-bills, which are what Stephanie Kelton calls yellow dollars. These yellow dollars are interest-bearing dollars. It's just an exchange from one kind of asset, green dollars, to another, yellow dollars. We can extend this metaphor to foreign debts, like debts to China, by adding another bucket with green and yellow dollars. When we understand how sectoral balances work and take into account the fact that the government bond market is its own special market without competition from other borrowers, we start to see why the crowding out story from earlier doesn't make sense, and not only is the debt not a big deal, we may not even want to pay it off. This chart shows how every major attempt to pay off the national debt has coincided with economic catastrophe, and it makes sense why the two would be linked. Government surpluses necessarily involve draining the private sector of money. So now we have a basic understanding of MMT's core ideas and how it applies to some basic economic issues. But if we were listening to an MMT theorist, what should we do policy-wise? Since we understand that the real limits of our economy are our resources, we need to make sure that we are using all of the resources that we have and that we are investing in getting more. Our current economic system is full of waste. There are kids going hungry while we overproduce food, there are homeless people languishing while housing lies vacant, and there are millions of people who are willing to work but unable to find jobs. These are all resources that could be used productively but are instead sitting idle. Think of the opportunity cost. The difference between our current level of productivity and our long-term potential productivity is called the output gap. Government spending where there is slack in the economy would close the output gap without causing significant inflation. Right now, it's like we're driving a Ferrari 2021 SF90 Spider at 30 miles an hour instead of revving that bad boy up to 211 miles per hour the way God intended. Now, both MMTers and mainstream economists agree that closing the output gap is important, but they disagree about how to measure and to attain the proverbial top speed of the economy. Because there is an inverse correlation between inflation and unemployment, mainstream economists have theorized that there is an optimal level of unemployment called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NIRU for short. They contend that if we have too little unemployment, we'll have a positive output gap where current productivity exceeds the long-term potential level, resulting in too much inflation. Many mainstream economists advocate for using monetary policy, which means having the Federal Reserve adjust the money supply in order to achieve the right balance. The problem with this is that nobody knows what the NIRU is, since it can't be calculated or observed, and it's led to some wrong predictions. In the years after the 2008 recession, people believed that disastrous inflation would ensue if unemployment dipped below 7%. But when unemployment fell to 5%, inflation stayed low. The NIRU is effectively an arbitrary number that causes us to treat the job market like a game of musical chairs that condemns many people to be losers by design. For this reason, MMTers advocate that we monitor inflation directly instead of using unemployment as an index of it. By using the right mixture of monetary and fiscal policy, we can achieve both price stability and low unemployment. Fiscal policy means direct government revenue collection and spending, like with taxes, programs, and services. It operates on the economy in a more direct manner than monetary policy, which works indirectly by encouraging economic activity. The Congressional Budget Office could help fine-tune fiscal policy by estimating the effects of government taxes and expenditures on inflation so that we don't get too much of it. Now, one obvious problem with fiscal policy is that it requires timely responses to the ebbs and flows of the economy, which would be hard enough even without Washington gridlock. Because of this, MMTers recommend focusing on non-discretionary spending, such as Medicare. Payments for Medicare Parts B and D are required by law to be made and don't require any agreement from those clowns over in Congress. Taking everything we've discussed so far into account, we understand the justification for modern monetary theory's flagship policy, the federal jobs guarantee. Unemployed people are by definition an unused resource and are suffering acutely from our economic system. A federally funded jobs guarantee administered locally in a decentralized fashion would increase our productivity and provide a living wage to the workers. It would work countercyclically as an automatic stabilizer. Spending on the program would increase during recessions as unemployment unemployment increases, and it would go back down when the hard times are over. I hope that by now that those watching the video can understand these 3 principles of modern monetary theory and how they relate to these 3 issues, as well as why these 3 policy objectives are warranted. Modern monetary theory is a controversial theory and not without reason. In my enthusiasm, I have no doubt made it sound like a no-brainer, but I hope that my viewers' engagement with the theory does not start and end with this video. I'm sure that there is plenty of room for nuanced and constructive dialogue with these ideas. That being said, a lot of the critique I've seen online has attacked a straw man of MMT. So I've linked one such article in the description, and I think that after watching the video, you can see what's wrong with it. I've also provided a link to an issue of the Real World Economics Review containing articles written by proponents and opponents of MMT. Even among its critics, MMT, with all of its bold statements that may seem counterintuitive to an average person, is, when represented correctly, the subject of nuanced critique rather than outright blunt rejection. A good example of this is the debate between Warren Mosler and Austrian economist Robert Murphy, where Robert Murphy's contention was not so much that Mosler's description of fiat currencies was wrong, but that a gold standard is preferable to a fiat currency. This lends credibility to the idea that an average person would do well to consider MMT's ideas and rethink how the economy works. Thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. If there was anything inaccurate or misleading about the video, please let me know and I'll add the corrections to a pinned comment in the comment section. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, this has been a Nerdy Tree production.